It was Christmas Eve 2019 in the upscale London neighbourhood of Battersea. Flamur Beqiri and his family strolled home under the glow of festive lights, returning from a cheerful evening out. As Flamur walked hand in hand with his wife Deborah, their 2-year-old son bundled beside them, the quiet night was suddenly torn apart by a crackle of gunfire. In an instant, the 36-year-old father crumpled to the ground at his own doorstep, mortally wounded by a flurry of bullets. His wife's scream pierced the cold air as she threw herself over their toddler, desperate to shield the child from the chaos. Inside the house, the couple's 3-month-old baby and visiting relatives froze in horror. What should have been a night of joy and warmth had transformed into a scene of bloodshed. The shooter, an unknown figure at that moment, vanished into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Flamur bleeding on the threshold and a family in despair. Neighbours, startled by the eruption of gunshots, 8 to 10 in quick succession, one recalled, rushed into the street. One neighbour, a nurse, knelt by Flamur's side and tried to stanch the bleeding, while Deborah sobbed in panic. They prayed he might hold on. But within minutes, before an ambulance could arrive, Flamur Beqiri's life slipped away. The Christmas lights continued to twinkle around the quiet street, now cordoned off by police tape, as detectives and medics arrived to a devastating crime scene. It appeared that a beloved husband and father had been executed in cold blood in front of his family. The question that hung in the icy air was, why? Who would carry out such a brazen killing on Christmas Eve, and who exactly was Flamur Beqiri? To the public, Flamur Beqiri's name was not widely known, until that night. In media reports that followed, he was often introduced as the brother of reality TV star Mr. Beckiri, a cast member of The Real Housewives of Cheshire. This family connection to celebrity brought an extra burst of tabloid attention. Photos circulated of Flamur smiling with his sister, and of his glamorous 2018 wedding to Deborah on the shores of Lake Como in Italy. By all accounts, Flamur was a successful businessman and doting family man. A Swedish national of Albanian heritage, he had moved to the UK in 2016, co-founding a record label with offices in London and Stockholm. He presented himself as a music producer and entrepreneur, someone who had left Sweden to build a new life. In London, he lived in a 1.7 million home and seemed to enjoy the fruits of legitimate success. But beneath that veneer of respectability, Flamur Beqiri led a double life, one steeped in the shadows of organized crime. In truth, he was a significant player in an international drug trafficking network. For over a decade, Flamur had been deeply involved in the narcotics underworld, dating back to his early 20s. In Sweden, he and a close circle of associates had risen in the ranks of a Malmö-based criminal organization. One of his closest friends was Naif Adawi, a man who himself was notorious for a bold $7 million cash heist in Denmark years earlier, one of the largest robberies in Danish history. Together with an up-and-coming gang leader named Daniel Petrovsky, Flamur and Adawi built a drug empire that funneled cocaine and cannabis across Europe. They laundered money through front businesses, Flamur's record label among them, and enjoyed a life of luxury by the time they reached their mid-30s. However, such a life comes with high stakes and deadly enemies. By 2019, Flamur Beqiri's criminal enterprise had drawn the ire of rival gangsters. Chief among them was another young crime boss, a 24-year-old named Amir Mekki, who helmed a competing network smuggling drugs at a similar international scale. A bitter feud erupted between the two syndicates, marked by vendettas and violence. Each side began hunting the other's allies, setting off a cycle of revenge. That year, back in Sweden, the conflict turned bloody and shockingly personal. In August 2019, in the city of Malmö, Flamur's friend Naif Adawi stepped out of his apartment building with his partner, Dr. Caroline Hakim, and their newborn baby girl. Suddenly, gunmen opened fire in a drive-by attack. Bullets whizzed as Adawi instinctively ran for cover, even dropping his infant daughter in the panic. Adawi survived the attempted hit, but the gunman's bullets struck his partner. Caroline Hakim, just 31 years old and a new mother, was killed in cold blood on the sidewalk while her baby lay on the ground nearby. The assassination, carried out in broad daylight, sent shockwaves through Sweden. It was quickly linked to associates of Amir Mekki. Investigators believed it was a message. a retaliation aimed to hit Adawi and his friends where it hurt the most. The brutal murder of an innocent woman escalated the underworld war to a new extreme. Those close to Flamur now realized that no one connected to the Petrovsky-Adawi network was safe, no matter where they were. Flamur Beqiri had by then settled in London, perhaps thinking that putting distance between himself and Sweden could shield him from the carnage. But the very same feud that killed his friend's partner was now casting its deadly gaze on him. Intelligence later suggested that Flamur had been marked for death by the rival gang sometime in 2019, likely after the Malmö shooting. Despite his attempts to live quietly and focus on family and business, he was a high-value target in an international crime vendetta, and his enemies were patient, professional, and determined. In the autumn of 2019, plans were set in motion to eliminate Flamur in London. A group of hired killers was assembled in Sweden, tasked with the organized hit. They were not impulsive street thugs, but a meticulous team that treated the assassination like a military operation. Leading the hit squad was a 24-year-old Swedish-Tunisian man named Anis Fuad Hemisi. Hemisi was an unlikely figure for a contract killer. A former professional kickboxer, physically fit, disciplined, and with no prior criminal convictions. But for the right price, he had turned himself into a gun for hire. Alongside Hemisi were several accomplices, each with a specific role in the plot. One was Estevan Pino Munizaga, 35, a fellow Swedish national who acted as the advanced scout and facilitator. Two other Swedish men, Tobias Andersson and Bauer Karaya, were allegedly involved as well, and there were whispers of a shadowy organizer coordinating from afar. As Christmas approached, the hit team made their moves. In November 2019, Estevan Pino Munizaga quietly flew into London for a mere 14 hours. In that brief window, he laid crucial groundwork. Under a false identity, Pino Munizaga rented a flat in a modern apartment complex called Oyster Wharf, not far from Flamur's home. He also did a reconnaissance walk through Flamur's upscale neighborhood to pinpoint the house and survey the surroundings. Before leaving London that day, he purchased an ordinary but distinctive lady's bicycle, complete with a front basket, at a local shop. This bike would later become a key element in the assassination plan, a convenient getaway vehicle that wouldn't arouse the same suspicion as a car. Weeks later, with everything prepared, the hit squad deployed for the kill. On 20th of December 2019, Anis Hemisi arrived in London. Using the rented Oyster Wharf flat as a safe house, he began to surveil Flamur's movements and routine. Hemisi was careful and patient. In the days leading up to Christmas, locals in Battersea would occasionally notice an odd figure around the quiet residential streets near the Thames. There was a man on a bicycle who seemed to be loitering and watching houses. At times, this man looked like a council worker or street cleaner. Dressed in a neon high-vis vest, navy workman's trousers, heavy gloves, and sturdy boots, carrying a litter picker stick and black trash bag as if tidying up rubbish. His face was obscured by a realistic latex mask, the kind used in movie prosthetics, topped with a woolly hat and sunglasses. To any casual observer, he might pass as an older sanitation worker going about his duties. In reality, it was Hemisi in disguise, casing Flamur Beqiri's home and the surrounding area, studying the layout and patterns of activity. The lady's bicycle with the basket, bought by Pino Munizaga, was his transport as he pedaled through the neighborhood, mapping escape routes and timing his approach. For a while, the ruse worked. Hemisi blended into the background of suburban London. The surveillance continued more discreetly until the time was right. He knew Flamur often returned home in the evening, and this night would be no different. Perhaps even more predictable with the holiday. Flamur, oblivious to the hitman lurking in the shadows, spent the evening of December 24, 2019, enjoying a Christmas celebration with family. Later that night, a little before 9 p.m., Flamur and Deborah left a gathering, perhaps a dinner with friends or a festive visit, and headed back to their home on Battersea Church Road. They were full of holiday cheer, their toddler son giggling as his mother carried him, and Flamur likely carrying gifts or guiding the stroller. As they approached their house, Flamur's thoughts might have been on putting the kids to bed and preparing for Christmas morning. They turned onto their quiet street lined with parked cars and townhouses, where only the muffled sounds of holiday laughter and clinking glasses could be heard in the distance. It was at this moment, in the glow of their porch light, that Anis Hemisi made his move. He had positioned himself nearby, possibly behind a hedge or around a corner, and now emerged with deadly purpose. In his hand was a semi-automatic handgun. Hemisi raised the weapon and in a split second began squeezing the trigger. A burst of gunfire shattered the silent night. Later, ballistic evidence would show he fired 10 shots in total. Caught completely off guard, Flamur was struck from behind. Bullets tore into his back before he could react or even turn to see his attacker. One after another, up to 8 rounds found their mark. Flamur collapsed forward onto the stone steps of his home, gravely wounded. Deborah, just a step ahead with their son in her arms, spun around at the sound of the shots. The sight behind her was every spouse's worst nightmare. Her husband sprawled on the doorstep, blood pooling beneath him, and a dark-clad figure with a gun standing just yards away. She screamed, a raw, visceral wail that echoed down the street, as she instinctively crouched over her little boy. Her scream of terror was so loud and desperate that neighbors heard it from inside their houses. Hemisi, having emptied his pistol's magazine in seconds, knew his task was done. He immediately fled, sprinting down the street and disappearing around a corner. In the frenzy, he left behind no words, only the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shell casings glinting on the pavement. As the shooter fled, neighbors began to react to the commotion. One resident, an older woman named Vittoria who lived nearby, later recounted that at first she thought the gunfire might be Christmas fireworks. Until she heard Deborah's piercing cries, Vittoria cautiously stepped outside, and what she saw was horrifying. Her neighbor, Flamur, lying face up in front of his doorway, blood everywhere, and his wife sobbing for help. Vittoria wasn't alone. Other residents emerged, alarmed by the noise. Amid the chaos, a young woman who was a trained nurse rushed to Flamur's side. Kneeling in the sticky pool of blood, she pressed her hands over his bleeding wounds, trying to stanch the hemorrhaging. Flamur was still alive, eyes open but fading, as multiple people tried to comfort him and stop the bleeding. Deborah, clutching her screaming child, begged for someone to save her husband. These were agonizing, frantic moments. The street that moments ago was peaceful and still was now filled with the blue lights of arriving police cars and the frantic shouts of people directing first responders to the victim. Paramedics reached Flamur and took over CPR and first aid, working against time. But the damage was catastrophic. Bullets had pierced vital organs. Despite the desperate efforts, Flamur Beqiri succumbed to his injuries there on the threshold of his home, just minutes after being shot. A family's world had been destroyed in a blink, and a murder investigation was just beginning. From the very start, London's Metropolitan Police recognized that this was not a typical homicide. The precision of the killing, the fact that nothing was stolen, and the extreme risk the shooter took by attacking in front of multiple witnesses suggested a professional hit. Detectives from the Met's Specialist Crime Command took charge. As forensic teams combed the driveway for shell casings and clues, other officers began canvassing the area for witnesses and surveillance footage. In a neighborhood like Battersea, they didn't have to look far. Security cameras are commonplace, and many homes had smart doorbell cams. Investigators soon found crucial footage from the days prior to the murder. Haunting images of a man on a bike, wearing a latex mask and cleaning uniform, touring the streets. Another clip showed what looked like the same man, without the disguise, walking with a bike near the Thames after the shooting. Piece by piece, the police mapped out the assassin's escape route. They determined that after fleeing on foot immediately from the scene, the gunman likely reached a spot where he'd stashed his getaway bicycle. Indeed, CCTV caught a figure believed to be Hemisi, mounting a bicycle along the river path and riding off into the night. That trail led them to Oyster Wharf, the apartment block by the river. By examining records and security logs, they discovered that a flat there had been rented out short-term just weeks earlier. Further digging, with assistance from Europol and Swedish authorities, revealed the renter's alias and connected it to Estevan Pino Munizaga. Suddenly, the case was pointing far beyond London. Within days, an international manhunt was underway. The Metropolitan Police liaised with Swedish police and Interpol as they identified the suspects who had already fled the UK. It emerged that Anis Hemisi, the suspected triggerman, had flown out of London just hours after gunning down Flamur. In the pre-dawn dark of Christmas Day, while British families opened presents or slept off their celebrations, Hemisi was on a flight to Copenhagen, Denmark. From there, he made his way out of Europe entirely, heading to Thailand to enjoy a holiday, perhaps thinking he had earned it after a job completed. He may have believed that in the confusion of an international plot, he could evade consequences, at least for a while. But the net was closing in on him far more quickly than he expected. Back in London, as the new year 2020 began, police gathered enough evidence to formally identify and charge Anis Hemisi, Estevan Pino Munizaga, and several others in absentia. European arrest warrants were issued. In January 2020, when Hemisi finally returned from Thailand to Europe, flying into Copenhagen once more, Danish authorities, tipped off by their British counterparts, were waiting. They arrested Hemisi at the airport. Not long afterward, Estevan Pino Munizaga was also located and detained. Over the coming months, 2 more alleged accomplices were arrested: Clifford Rolox, a 31-year-old from London, and Claude Isaac Castor, a 31-year-old Dutch national from the Caribbean island of Sint Maarten. Rolox and Castor were not part of the hit team themselves. Instead, they had been recruited to clean up the evidence. Investigators discovered that on the night of the murder, after Hemisi fled, Rolox and Castor entered the rented flat to retrieve incriminating items. They disposed of the gun and other materials used in the operation, hoping to erase any traces that could lead back to the hit squad. Their quick arrests signaled that the police had cracked much of the conspiracy wide open. By mid-2020, the key players directly involved in Flamur Beqiri's assassination were in custody, either in the UK or extradited back to face British justice. Yet the question remained: who ordered this high-profile killing? The evidence strongly suggested the motive lay in the feud with Amir Mekki's gang. Mekki himself, the young crime boss, had gone into hiding around the same time Flamur was killed, likely aware that law enforcement and rival gangsters were after him. He was eventually captured in June 2020, not in Sweden but in Dubai, during a global crackdown on organized crime. Mekki was later transferred to Spain, where he faced charges related to his drug empire. Meanwhile, Swedish prosecutors pursued cases against Daniel Petrovsky, Naif Adawi, and their associates, including a plot to retaliate for the murder of Caroline Hakim. It seemed that the authorities on multiple fronts were seizing the opportunity to take down both gangs as they dealt with the fallout of the London hit. Flamur's case finally came to trial in London in early 2022, just over 2 years after his death. The courtroom was riveted as the prosecution laid out the tale of international intrigue and gangland rivalry. Jurors watched CCTV clips of Hemisi in his bizarre disguises roaming Flamur's street. They saw footage of the actual shooting, grainy night vision images capturing muzzle flashes and a figure firing at the victim, though mercifully the resolution spared the court the most graphic detail. Witnesses, including neighbors like Jeremy Lyons and the nurse who tried to save Flamur, testified about what they saw and heard on that fateful night. For the first time, Flamur's family also heard in chilling clarity how the murder had been orchestrated. Prosecutor Louise Attrell explained that this was not a random act, but part of a tit-for-tat rivalry between 2 very significant organized crime groups. As she spoke, the context of Flamur's secret life and deadly enemies came into full view. Deborah Beckiri, who had maintained that she believed her husband was an honest businessman, listened as the prosecution detailed his involvement in serious crime. It was an agonizing revelation, but also an explanation for the nightmare that befell her family. Anis Hemisi chose to plead not guilty, forcing the trial and maintaining a veneer of innocence. Perhaps he hoped the evidence was too circumstantial to conclusively pin him as the masked cyclist or the man behind the gun. But this hope was in vain. The forensic and digital evidence was compelling. DNA traces, travel records, and the pattern of phone communications all tied Hemisi to the plot. Additionally, his accomplices' involvement painted a cohesive picture of the planning and execution. The jury was not swayed by Hemisi's defense, whatever it may have been. In February 2022, they returned with a unanimous verdict. Anis Hamisi was found guilty of the murder of Flamur Beqiri and possession of a firearm with intent. Estevan Pino Munizaga, although acquitted of murder itself, was found guilty of manslaughter, reflecting his role in enabling the killing without being the one who pulled the trigger. Clifford Rollox and Claude Castor were found guilty of perverting the course of justice for their attempt to destroy evidence. As for the two other Swedish suspects, Tobias Andersson and Bauer Karaja, they were acquitted due to insufficient evidence of their direct involvement. And an alleged mastermind, Ahmet Karaja, Bauer's cousin, suspected of financing and organizing the hit, had fled and remained wanted by police. During the sentencing hearing, the judge addressed the court with solemn words. She spoke of the stark contrast between Flamur Beqiri's two worlds. Flamur Beqiri, she noted, was suspected of involvement in international drug dealing and other serious crime. He was also a son, a partner, and a father. She emphasized that regardless of his illicit activities, nothing could justify the brutal way in which his life was taken or ease the grief of those who loved him. Turning to the man convicted of carrying out the murder, the judge said, "Anis Hamisi, in 2019 you were a gun for hire. This was international crime at its most brutal." She highlighted the intricate planning that allowed Hamisi to fly into a foreign country, execute a targeted killing in front of the victim's family, and flee within hours. It was, in her words, an audacious execution meant to instill terror not just in Flamur's circle in London, but also to reverberate back in Sweden and beyond. A message from one crime group to another. Justice Chimagrub then handed down sentences meant to reflect the severity of the crime. Hamisi received life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years to be served behind bars before any possibility of parole. Given his young age of 24 at conviction, this effectively meant he would be an old man if he ever walked free. Pino Munizaga was sentenced to 15 years in prison for manslaughter, a lesser sentence recognizing he hadn't pulled the trigger, but still long enough to punish his significant role. He would have to serve at least 2/3 of that term. Clifford Rollox and Claude Castor each received 3-year prison terms for their part in covering up the crime. Small cogs in the machine, but the judge made clear that even peripheral players in such a heinous crime would face consequences. For Flamur's family, no sentence could undo their suffering. Neither prison time nor guilty verdicts could bring back a loving father and husband. Deborah Beckiri had to relive the trauma of witnessing her husband's murder throughout the trial. Flamur's children will grow up with only the faintest memories of their father, the older child haunted by that night, the younger never having known him at all. Flamur's sister, Miss, whose celebrity status put an extra spotlight on the case, mourned the loss of her brother in private agony, even as the public consumed the lurid details of his death and criminal ties. Outside the personal tragedy, the assassination of Flamur Beqiri sent ripples through law enforcement agencies across Europe. It exposed how far an organized crime feud could reach, from a dispute between gangsters in Sweden to a meticulously planned murder on the streets of London. Investigators in multiple countries, by collaborating, managed to take down significant figures on both sides of that feud. In the years since Flamur's death, many of the Petrovsky gang members have been imprisoned for various offences, and similarly, the Beckiri network has been disrupted. Swedish police noted that most of Petrovsky's people are now in custody, and Beckiri and his closest associates are also behind bars or facing trial. The bloody tit-for-tat cycle may have finally been broken by these arrests, preventing further retaliatory killings, at least for now. Yet the story of Flamur Beqiri's murder remains a chilling example of the global reach of organized crime. It shows how a man who tried to start anew in a different country could not escape the tentacles of his past. Flamur's life was complex, at once a caring family man and a criminal kingpin. His death was a convergence of those two worlds in the most horrifying way imaginable. For the residents of Battersea, the notion that a gangland hit could happen on their quiet doorstep was unbelievable, until it happened. In the aftermath, many struggled to reconcile the friendly neighbor who waved hello on morning walks with the revelation that he had been embroiled in drug trafficking and targeted by international assassins. Today, the house where Flamur lived with his young family still stands on that peaceful street, But the family is gone, and a dark memory lingers. Floral tributes and candles that once piled up after the murder have long been cleared away. Yet the community has not forgotten the violence that struck on Christmas Eve. In the broader sense, Flamur Beqiri's fate is a cautionary tale about the perils of the criminal underworld. There are no true winners in such a world, only lives lost or ruined, whether by murder, imprisonment, or grief. On that silent night turned violent, a father was taken away forever, and a wife and children were left with trauma and sorrow that will last a lifetime. Flamur's assassination underscored how vengeance from a distant feud could pierce the heart of a family halfway across the continent. It is a story of a man who lived on the edge between two lives, and how that edge finally gave way. As the documentary of these events ends, we are left with the image of Christmas lights glowing softly in a Battersea street and the echoes of a woman's scream fading into the night. A stark reminder of the human cost of organized crime and a night when a family's world was irrevocably shattered in the glow of the holiday season.